To our starting time. For everyone who's just joined the room, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Viviana. I am part of the APA Diversity Committee, and I'll be moderating this collection of what we're calling flash sessions. So we are going to follow the program, meaning we're going to start with Deborah Morris with co-creating a new narrative for economic impact. She's going to speak, followed by Jin, and finally Spencer. And then we will have a collective Q&A. So please make sure to send your questions in the chat. And when it comes time, I will ask them for you all. And hopefully we'll have a seamless and informative session. Deborah?
Hey, Viviana, I'm just gonna share my screen. Great. Can you all see that? Well, it's so exciting to be here. My name's Deborah Morris. I'm in Brooklyn on the ancestral lands of the Lenape and Canarsie people. I'm trained as an urban planner, and most of my work is centered around climate adaptation and social equity. But I did spend some time working as an economic development planner. And what I wanted to talk about today very rapidly is economic impact analysis, which is something I think many of us have read or heard about when there's a project in our communities that sounds like it's going to solve so many problems simply by creating large numbers of jobs and bringing significant investment. The numbers are usually huge and conjure up a spirit of transformation through a combination of corporate investment and philanthropy. But where do these numbers come from? What do they mean? And who will experience the transformation? When these numbers are being thrown around in the context of public subsidy, land, zoning, tax assistance, how can we use the same vocabulary to understand the trade-offs? And more importantly, how can we understand the limitations of these models and vocabulary and introduce ways to more inclusive and qualitative values into the language so that these discussions are less polarizing and more a way to collaboratively design inclusive communities? So first, let's quickly understand what you normally hear. Usually it's a variation of a business wants to build a building that'll house its company. It needs a zoning waiver, or maybe the city is going to provide tax incentives or grants to attract that business. And there'll be a direct impact, which is money spent on staff, indirect impact, money spent by suppliers, and induced impact, the money spent by the staff using their salaries. So it's a complicated linear relationship where you're estimating money spent on salary from custodians to the CEO, and then the types of supplies based on the type of business, so paper, computers, meals, and then you model where that money goes across other businesses, their salaries, their suppliers, and how that grows the economy. And then finally, you look at how growth is induced, and that's where employees spend their salaries. So the things you spend your money on: rent, groceries, iPhones, Netflix. Usually you use a complicated software, Implan or Remi, to calculate the different types of multipliers for different businesses. And you'll see that different businesses have different impacts. 100 jewelers are not the same as 100 lawyers. And these studies are used to make the case for a trade-off. The return on the investment in land, subsidies, zoning density is worth the jobs and money that will be created and spent later down the line. And it's important, this is a much more complicated version of the model I just showed you. But it's important to remember that this is a model, and models are always oversimplified ways to present extremely complicated issues. But there's something I find really problematic. First of all, these are input-output models, which are by their nature linear and one-directional. They use a language of exclusion, narrowly focused on job growth rather than quality. And these models are used more for marketing purposes rather than determining how to shape a proposal to encourage the most inclusive forms of growth. They don't address power differentials or barriers to participation, including racism, segregation, or classism. And they don't show if there's a skills mismatch, like when a company relocating to a place where the locals aren't trained in that line of business. So I think this is a good moment to look at a fairly recent controversial example in New York City, Amazon's proposed campus in Long Island City and its failed proposal for public subsidy. Amazon proposed to build a campus of at least 4 million square feet on the East River on a site that was partially publicly owned and partially privately owned, and would create 25,000 to 40,000 jobs in the Amazon's second headquarters. It would be a significant amount of construction, and then those jobs would indirectly create 87,000 jobs and generate and induce 27.5 billion in public revenue. That's a whole lot, but this comes at a cost. And it comes at a cost of the city and the state providing almost 900 million in relocation assistance for employees coming from elsewhere, 386 million in commercial rent abatement, $505 million grant, and $102.2 billion in tax credits if job creation goals are met. In total, that's $2.9 billion, which the city and state together would be paying Amazon $48,000 per job. But rarely is that impact compared to what might have happened without that subsidy, or if that subsidy had been allocated differently. In the case of Amazon, why wasn't there a discussion of the economic impact of the previous plan for the area, which included the creation of a school and affordable housing? Also, how well really would this proposal connect local skills to those new jobs?
You know that we are nearing time.
Got it. And when we're talking about how to get our government to best serve us, and how an investment in a private business compares to other social welfare services, like providing public small business incubation space, providing access to subsidized childcare, or simply upgrading mass transit. So there are more questions we should be asking. So there's a problem with this linear relationship that direct, indirect, induced is sort of demonstrating a relationship between corporate power, the use of public resources that trickles down to workers and residents. So what I propose is that we can move away from indirect and direct language and use a more collaborative vocabulary to make discussions more transparent. And instead of discussing direct or indirect impact, let's discuss community shareholder impact and evaluate the use of public resources, public benefits, shareholders, both public and private, and different models of collaborative and cooperative ownership and investment that can keep job creation and job projects rooted in the locality. Recognizing that public and private contributions are both critical to economic success, I think it's an important opportunity to reclaim the term shareholder value so we can move away from more extractive and racialized components of capitalism and allow space for discussions and community and collaborative models, and use this language to co-design economic development projects that can best fit our own communities. Thank you. That was very fast. But excited to hear your questions.
Thank you, Deborah. We are now going to move forward and hear from Jin, who's presenting on Green Book Color Line.
Yes. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share my lovely. I'm doing my very best. If I disappear, I'll come back. I promise. Okay. I don't know what's happening, but let's see one more time. There we go. I hope everyone can see that at this point. Yes? Okay, except I did, so sorry, stepped in the wrong place. There we go. Okay, let's start over, take two. Good afternoon, my name is Jin Wen, and my day job is working with geospatial data all day and answer the question, what's happening here? I'm delighted to be part of the Flash Talk today, and this is Green Book Color Line. The Green Book was a travel guide that was first printed in 1936 in the era of segregation, listing restaurants, hotels, shops, and gas stations that would serve African Americans that were safe for them. Following the signing of the Civil Rights Act, the Green Book stopped publication in 1966. So what is my take? After listening to the interview on Fresh Air on NPR with the filmmaker Yoruba Richin on her documentary, The Green Book Guide to Freedom, I looked up the guides. I flipped through several of them and thought, what does this might look like as a map? But first, a brief recap of the book and the people behind it. Victor Hugo Green was a postal worker, and he married a lovely Miss Alma Duke from Richmond, Virginia. They met in Brooklyn. It was their annual drive to Virginia to visit her family that inspired this venture. The first edition was about 10 pages thick, covering only New York City and Westchester. And by New York City, I'm in Manhattan. And by the last edition 1966, the guide was over 100 pages with international coverage. I started to create this data set in March 2019, but took a break. And during the COVID-19, I got my daughters to help enter the data. This data set has over 1,000 records covering these years, and you will notice there's some gaps because that's what's available at the Schomburg Library. This data, we will visualize this data spatially. A big thank you to Adiola Owie, a colleague and a fellow geospatial practitioner who is actually here, who created the web map you will see later and extracted the stats featured. Sorry, here we go. I have to stop sharing here for a bit. Please bear with me. Lovely screen. Sorry, guys, I have to switch to another app. So here we are. This is the web map Adiola created. And first, we'll look at the 1937 to 41 business listings. So you can see it's not surprising they're mostly in Harlem and parts of Bedford-Stuy. And then 1947, the number grew, but all of a sudden you see a growing number and a lot of more listings in the Bronx and some in Midtown. By 1951 and 60, all of a sudden, wow, Staten Island and also College Point. But what is most surprising in 1967, when all of a sudden there's a whole lot of folks listing from Midtown. Now, the story gets even more interesting when we put on the homeowner's loan corp grade, also known as redlining, and we'll look at that data set again. As we layer different layers, we can start to see different stories. By 1967, I just wanted to kind of highlight, go in. This is now, some of you may be familiar. Here we have the Mayflower Hotel at 15 Central Park. And here we'll have Pierre Hotel still hanging around. And let's not forget the lovely Copacabana nightclub. Okay, I have to go back now. Sorry, folks. I'm sharing this. I hope it's sharing correctly. Am I not sharing?
Screen.
Oh, so sorry. Take two. This was so much easier live. Anyway, so we're good. Great, thank you. Now for the spreadsheet fans, we'll take a look at the top 5. Always a winner. Here we have the same breakdown as you see in the map. You will notice that here's a breakdown of top businesses by categories. Taverns, hotels, and restaurants remain the top listings throughout the years. As I noted with Copacabana, nightclubs start to show up in the 61, 67 publications. And here's a breakdown by neighborhood. Manhattan continued to dominate, colored in orange. Other boroughs, Brooklyn and Bronx, continue to grow over the years. But by the 60s, you'll notice, and I've noted before, Manhattan dominates the top 5 neighborhoods. But this time around, you'll note that Midtown South, and also Turtle Bay and Midtown East appeared in the listing. Now, 294 businesses appeared 5 times or more during the publication, the 30 years of publication. And here are the top 20 businesses. Top 5 categories were taverns, hotel, restaurant, wine shop, and barbershop, mostly in Manhattan. Within, I just want to highlight a couple of fun things in here. Within the restaurant subcategory, there was the Chinese restaurant, and there were 3. Mei Ling in Hamilton Heights held the longest record of 9 years, from 1947 to 1955. And Teresa, located in Brownsville, was a school of beauty and culture. It was listed in the guide from 1939 to 1955. And a shout out to the YMCA in Harlem and all the YMCAs that provide a safe place to rest. As you can see, the top 20 YMCA was listed twice in that many years.
I just want to let you know we're nearing time.
Great. So this was an introduction in the first edition. Now, do we still have a green book today? And what might it look like? And a modernized version is an app with GPS technology inspired by the original guidebook. This is an RV search app that helps minority and LGBT plus travelers research and find safe spaces for overnight parking. So that's my take. Thanks for dropping in. I hope I can come back next year to share more info with everyone. Please do place your feedback in the chat. I'd love to hear what you thought, and your feedback is sought and valued. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jen. We are now going to move on and hear from Spencer Williams. This session is titled Reforming CEQR for More Equitable Neighborhoods.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Not yet. Okay, let's try this one more time. What about now?
We can see it now.
Wonderful. Sorry for the delay, everyone. My name is Spencer Williams. I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Municipal Art Society of New York. I'm really excited to be sort of closing out this last session to really talk about how data is power and how that data can be matched with sort of a city process to really change and transform how people can engage in city processes. So in partnership with the Regional Plan Association and NYU, we've been developing a web map to really empower communities with data about development and social factors to really engage in the city's environmental review process. We call that work task. It's really important, especially in New York. We've seen a lot of large-scale neighborhood rezonings really dramatically shift and change the impact of what's happening in neighborhoods, whether that's access to schools, displacement risk, access to jobs and services, infrastructure projects. Oftentimes what we've seen over the last couple of years is that communities are really pushing back on these processes. And part of that pushback is that the sort of questions, the concerns, the inquiries that they're saying need to be a part of the decision-making are oftentimes left out of the city's sort of technical process. And so when advocates fight really hard to get those things put on the table as a really important decision-making factor, oftentimes they're not, and the pushback to those plans, because those questions remain unanswered, sort of remain. What we see is that when our communities don't have power in that process, those processes don't have community trust, and also our communities don't have a seat at the table. And I think we lose when that happens. One of the ways that we like to think of the city's environmental quality review process is it's the process by which we agree upon what information is really critical to make a land use decision. And so while it is a very technical process that involves residents, local organizations, the city, community boards, oftentimes these voices are not balanced in this process. And so what we have currently is a real power differential amongst the sort of city and technical planning processes and grassroots community response and engagement with those processes. What that looks like is we have a really top-down technocratic planning process. So seeker analyzes the impacts of discretionary land use decisions, which ultimately end up being around 10% of the development that we see in New York. While that's a small percentage, something like a neighborhood rezoning can really be impactful and can change the course of development, not just for that neighborhood, but for the surrounding community, borough, and city for many, many years to come. As I said before, that often leads to then a sort of grassroots community bottom-up response that is really trying to get things put on the table to be considered as part of those land use decision-making processes. What happens is then communities are told that these issues may be out of scope, they may not fall within the bounds of that technical analysis, or may be a result of a community learning from what happened to a previous rezoning and say, hey, we learned and saw those impacts. You have yet to update your methodology to fully address those, and we have a right and reason to be concerned. So what we see in the middle of that process is there is some overlap, but it doesn't really leave a lot of space for trust, and it leaves a lot of issues off the table. What this mapping project hopes to do is to really uplift those community voices by equipping the communities with the data. Oftentimes, these technical planning processes come out in large, multi-hundred-page documents that are hard to sift through. And communities can't sort of ask and answer their own questions about how things are laying out on the built environment. So to combat this, what we've done is we started by building an index. We identified a lot of the key publicly available information that would be really helpful to use and have at communities' disposal during these decisions. Everything from flood risk, historic districts and landmarks, fresh food zones, and then we wanted to group those things into sort of bundles that were a little bit easier to understand so that we can sort of begin to demystify the complexity of each of these individual aspects to communicate more broadly to people that may not be as familiar with land use. The scale that we decided to build this mapping tool on was basically any tax lot in the city. We want to be able to compare across a particular building, at a neighborhood scale, across boroughs. And so really starting this index at the tax lot level allows us to scale this tool to be able to compare and aggregate information and layer information really well. And so on this slide, you can see those basic groupings of socioeconomic categories, neighborhood conditions. Those really all boil down to displacement risk and helping us understand what areas may see development based on their underlying neighborhood conditions.
Spencer, I just want to let you know that we're nearing time.
Okay, thank you. So at a neighborhood scale, we can look at beginning to think about where cost burden renters are, how the underlying zoning allows for residential uses, and then also think about where there's unused development capacity to really start to get a picture of what's happening in that neighborhood. We can layer on additional categories as needed. We can also do that at a citywide scale and really look at something like access to subway as it relates to places that have cost burden households, and really look at how the development picture looks citywide on something like parks as well, to think about those sort of collective impacts. We hope that this project can really help strengthen the environmental review process by daylighting some of the methodologies, but also ultimately help really support community-based and citywide planning, improving the quality of questions and the quality of answers that communities can get. For more information, you can go to our website and find out more about us and as well as our partners RPA in this, and I look forward to your questions in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Spencer. So I'm going to start with the first question that we got, which I think was for Jin, actually. Leslie Bowden asked, are the businesses that are included Black-owned businesses or ones that were identified as welcoming people of color?
I don't know, but I think from what I've read, it is definitely mostly POCs, and also obviously will welcome.
Okay, great. It looks like our next question is for Deborah from Naja Barlera, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Deborah, in shifting to a language of inclusivity and job quality, how could this facilitate the crafting of policy that ensures labor standards and collective bargaining rights? Oh, I think your microphone is down. We can't hear you yet, no. Well, in the meantime, we'll come back to this question, Deborah. The next one is for Spencer. Nika Sobers asked, how can we access this tool? Do you have a link maybe?
So the tool is still under development. At this point, we have built the index. We'll be looking for some ways to further develop and engage more communities with this tool to really make sure that the usability can match all the needs. And so I would say to go to that website, mas.org/task, to find updates for that project over the coming months.
Okay, and you said mas.org/tasks?
Task, T-A-S-C.
Okay, great. Deborah, do you want to try speaking of this again? Oh, I guess Deborah will be back.
Sorry, I was trying to play with the, yeah?
Yes, okay.
All right, good. Sorry about that. That was a great question, Naja. I mean, I think one of the most important things is to introduce more discussion of both the types of labor that are involved in employment when you're talking about part of the challenge is like right now, the discussion is all responsive. So we have an entity that's proposing a project and they analyze its impacts, or the city or state analyzes the impacts, and then we respond and hopefully extract some kind of benefit, but it doesn't start from a mutual discourse. What I think is really important is to have a shared language of discussing like who's employed, how are they employed, what are their wages? I think collective bargaining is absolutely part of that. But also, one of the flaws I find in these models at this point is like, they don't really capture the fact that a lot of our spending isn't local anymore. Like many of us are in offices that don't buy our office supplies from a local supplier. Our paper isn't locally made. Like that isn't flowing into our community in a closed system. And so therefore you're not getting this exponential growth, and you're also not able to have a discussion of whether those benefits are being spread fairly. So it's not a discussion of not just how I used Amazon because I think it's a very provocative example, but it's not just how Amazon's employees paid. It's like how well are the people compensated who are providing goods and services to Amazon, and the people who are providing goods and services to those businesses that support the businesses that are supporting Amazon, because we're all in it together. Yeah, I hope that helps.
That was a really great answer and a good question.
Yeah, great question.
We got another question for you, actually, Deborah. This one is from Kate Sheldon. Yeah, is there still room in these new metrics for numerical analysis, even if looking at different categories? And what are some more examples of the specific metrics? Suggesting, but.
Yeah, I think numeric analysis is really important, and I think one of the challenges in these discussions, top down or grassroots up, is we're not using the same language, and bringing everyone into a same level of like numerical literacy is challenging, and part of that is trying to make sure we're talking about the same things, which I often feel like we're not when we're talking about when you read these reports that just talk about jobs or talk about investment. Like, what does it mean? But I think there's a lot of space in analyzing exactly like how that investment is captured, and who are the shareholders in that investment. And I'm not going on like the full anti-capitalist rant, but I think it's like pretty provocative when you have projects that are getting extensive public support that you're not also including, well, the public is a shareholder. So how is that shareholder getting value, and how can we measure that besides taxes? Because it's actually not the same. Like you are receiving that. If a business succeeds, there is growth that generates taxes, assuming all their taxes aren't abated. But that's not the only way the public could get value, and that's certainly not the whole way a community could gain value. And I think we can introduce more numerical language and calculations around that if that's where we can bring the discussion to.
Did you want to jump in, Spencer?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say that I think what you're bringing up is really critical, that we're in a time in which, as we approach sort of what is an equitable recovery, and as we start to see more and more land use processes, it's a critical time to really be building community capacity to participate meaningfully in those processes. We need to reform so many of them. But in the meantime, I think this sort of data literacy, shared power that comes from language and access to information is something that hopefully we can do a lot more of. And I know that organizers are doing that work every single day.
Our next question is actually for you, Spencer, so it's very convenient you have reason to chime in. This question comes from Bernard Bonse. He's asking, or they are asking, how are the specific data sets described or explained to the audience, including the assumptions behind how these data sets are sourced and compiled? And how do they connect to sections of the CQR manual?
Those are two very good questions. So the data set pulls from publicly accessible data. In most cases, that is a sort of one-to-one translation, depending on the scale of data that we're using. And so we try to report margins of error within that data set so people can know the sort of quality of the data that they're seeing, as well as aligning with the seeker manual in terms of the distances that are typically used in terms of quarter mile, half mile, eighth of a mile, that correspond to the technical manual's directions. And so where possible, we are matching up with those geographies so that communities can ask and answer those questions independently. But in many cases, we have gone beyond what's articulated within the seeker manual, because we often have those same questions ourselves as an advocacy organization when we're reviewing proposals, whether they're from the city or for private applicants. And so we try to daylight those, and we'll be doing a lot of work to make sure that as the tool goes live, all of that process and training can really happen and be as seamless as possible.
Okay, and the next question for you, Spencer, from Sandra Rothbard is, how will this put pressure on developers to actually mitigate and address environmental impacts versus simply identifying them?
It's a great question and a hard it's a disclosure tool. It is primarily built to help disclose information. And so ultimately that comes from what is the strength of the planning process and the land use process. And so if we don't know enough to ask and answer the questions, those things can't be a part of the decision-making process. And so when we look at somewhere like Inwood, a neighborhood in northern Manhattan that was rezoned, the community brought a challenge to that, saying that the city failed to incorporate certain decision-making, and that's sort of up in question now. There is a victory by the neighborhood, and they're sort of coming back to that decision of should that information have been part of the decision-making process. I think that that's a really good example of how having that information, as opposed to saying you didn't do the analysis, if you can do the analysis yourself, you can point to real harms and have real power, and saying, here is the impact of this land use decision that you made. We told you about it, we saw it, and here's sort of why you should have thought about that earlier in the process.
Okay, we have a question for Jin here from Donald Burns. What were some of your challenges mapping the Green Book data?
I feel that unfortunately there's several additions that were not available. So from an analysis standpoint, is a shame. But what is interesting is that over the years, where in the beginning, Brooklyn was part of New York City, all of a sudden got broken up to Brooklyn, and that we didn't notice it. It was under B. And the Queens was become Long Island. So from a spatial standpoint, it was just quite fascinating to learn how New York City was perceived over all these decades. And of course, looking at the screen all day for about 1,000 records. That's why I got my my daughters to do it. It was really aging eyes, but I'm delighted to get a start, and I just wonder what the rest of the country might look like with all those other cities. Thanks for the question.
Spencer, we have some more questions for you. So, do you think that TASK can assist with analysis of site-wide text amendment or just rezonings? This question is from Manuela.
I think that it can help with both. And so the question is about the scale of the tool. And so if we were looking at a text amendment for a particular zone in the city that may apply to either that underlying zone or a district in the city, we can do that kind of analysis. I think it's really helpful in both circumstances.
Okay. Deborah, I have a question for you from myself. So sometimes conversations about economic development can feel unbalanced. So I'm wondering how, in your perspective, we can use this new vocabulary to kind of level participation.
That's a great question, Viviana. I mean, I think this is something Spencer's really been hitting on too, is just like the importance of one, building literacy, and two, introducing a vocabulary that allows it to be a two-way discussion rather than a single-way approval process. I think that one of the great challenges is if you're looking at a proposal and the proposal is all on its own, you don't have a lot of space for discussion versus seeing it as something either along a spectrum or in comparison to alternatives. And my hope is, one, by introducing more vocabulary around collective value, and seeing all of a community as shareholders in economic development, that you can move away from this one-sided discussion and have a more balanced set of benefits and drawbacks, because nothing's perfect. And also have more of a collective discussion about really what's helpful and could be transformative.
Okay, this might feel like a slight stretch, but earlier in the day we had a really great session about community currency. And so because you just mentioned community value, I'm wondering how you think those might be able to come together, considering your tool.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely a space for community currency or alternative forms of currency or bartering. I do think one of the challenges we have now, and sort of what's I find very problematic about these economic impact models now, is so much of the value and services we're using isn't local. So it becomes hard if you have a community currency and then you still are using introducing other systems and goods into it. It becomes complicated on what is the value and do we all share it? But I think it's the same. Currency is just one more vocabulary that we all share. We all share and agree what a dollar is worth to an extent. And when we don't, that's actually a pretty provocative discussion. So that I think there's great space for that.
One of the comments, again from Kate, is actually that it would be cool to make a similar public tool like TASK for the economic impact model that you introduced.
I 100% agree. I wish I was that good at economics that I could, and computer programming so that I could make it. But right now those programs are tens of thousands of dollars.
That's true, but if the two of you are open to it, you'd be surprised how many really brilliant and interesting people who come to Hindsight, and particularly VidCon, would probably be willing to volunteer to work on these.
Yeah, no, we've got to build this literacy and build the tools. It's great.
There is another question for Jin here from Mariano Moran. He asks, do you see the Green Book app or others like it gaining more relevance in the near future, and why? Please make sure to.
Yes. So I think what is interesting about the Green Book is that when we talk about we're looking, get an opportunity to look back, right, and kind of look forward. And there was actually some healthcare impact using Green Book and saying, is it still true today? So I can see that's why I am interested to take it to the next level. And I added just for this round the red line. Can you imagine other healthcare impact that we see from all the neighborhoods, even environmental pieces together? And I'm adding myself to your pieces, folks, your tools. So from the past to the present, and so we can perhaps project to the future. Mariano, hope I answered your question.
I know that no one in the chat has mentioned it, but there is a series called Lovecraft Country,
Yes.
and that's exactly what I thought of with your work, Jin.
So even I believe I did not see the show, but I believe season 2 and season 1, sorry, they too have their own safe guide as well. They came up with their own.
Yeah, that's the point of their travel was to create that.
But also,
another question for you, Spencer. What did you? Digital tools and engagement are so valuable in bringing more people to the table, especially during pandemics. Do you have any thoughts on how to balance reaching out to more people via the digital world and not leaving out older folks who may not be as familiar with it?
That's a really great question. I think the digital tools can be really helpful in supplementing the on-the-ground people work. And so what we've witnessed in New York City from other digital tools, some really great people doing great work like Just Fix NYC, like ANHD with their displacement alert portal and project, is that when that data is equipped with organizers on the ground, they can then use that time that they would have otherwise been spending sort of doing research and doing technical analysis, doing actually face-to-face, door-to-door, flyer-to-flyer, post-to-post, getting that information out to communities. And I think that digital tools are really always only going to be as effective as the organizing that backs them up. And I think that in order for communities to really have power in the land use process, they also need to show up at city council meetings and talk to their elected officials. And it doesn't replace that work. It should hopefully supplement and make more time for that work, because less time is spent doing the digital detailed data crunching and number crunching. That's my hope, is how those sort of things marry each other.
One of the really big takeaways for the community currency discussion was how elderly people will be able to get benefit from there. We know that usually they are people who are most active politically and in their communities. They just seem to have the time, but we also know that they can be more challenged with technological advances. So I wonder if that's a system we could eventually find a way to connect. The next question is actually for Deborah.
Oh, I'm back. Sorry.
Cool. I will let you all know we have just under 15 minutes left in the session, so we're going to try to get through as many questions as we can. Deborah, this question is again from Mariano. Independent studies of alternative scenarios around big budget projections could be so valuable for the communities instead of the current yes or no process. Do you have any thoughts on this? Well, it's not a question, it's more of a comment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that, I think this is the same challenge that Spencer's hinted at with Seeker, that when you only get one point of view, it's hard to have a real discussion about it. And, there are many parts, most of data and analysis is an art and not a science. So you see a lot of imposed values on what's shown. And so I think either independent studies or counter-comparative, like more comparable projects, so that you can kind of have more of an evaluative discussion rather than just like a simple yes, no. I think it's really hard that it all boils down to a yes, no, when it should be yes, but, or if only, like, yeah.
Another question for you, Deborah, from Donald Burns is, how might telework change some of our current assumptions in the indirect model?
Oh, that's a great question. It actually affects direct impact as well as indirect and induced, because, if you're a company with office space in Midtown Manhattan right now, you're no longer filling your building with supplies. Like your employees are wherever they are. And either your employees have taken on the cost of those supplies, which happens often, or you're supplying them wherever they are. And it depends, or they're making purchases. For instance, like I frequently, when I worked in an office, would go out to lunch. Now I'm not doing that because I'm working from home. So that's a real benefit for my grocery store around the corner and my bodega and, the couple of places that I can buy lunch from here. But all of the businesses I supported previously by my office, that's a significant loss. And I don't think these models at all accurately capture telework, or, the likely spectrum of work alternatives where people are in and out of different spaces, and not as locally centered.
Jin, I actually had a question for you as well. This is my own personal question, not from the chat. So I noticed that in your presentation, taverns, can you hear me, Jin? Oh, I noticed. Sure. So I noticed in your tables that taverns saw a pretty significant decline, whereas bars rose a little bit, and nightclubs rose, but not the same. And so I was wondering what kind of impact that might have had on the sense of community, right? Because at least in my understanding, taverns are more like coffee shops, except they serve alcohol, whereas bars don't have necessarily that community vibe, the people that you see maybe every Friday and Saturday that you go and you talk to.
So
I look into that at all, or find something, or just have an opinion?
So it's interesting. As I go in through, I think another thing that's interesting about this, like looking back, is a definition of tavern. I think tavern also at one point had the idea of sleeping quarters. You can actually food, drinks, and a place to rest your head. And I say, because hotel went up, but tavern went down, if you noticed. And I was also making an assumption that perhaps that's also gave a place of a hotel. So that's another question I think I have to look into. What does tavern, all these categories meant? And one of the interesting things that we didn't showcase here this time is the idea of schools. A lot of beauty schools came up. Unfortunately, they were in top 20. Next year, I'll be back and take another look at it and show really another picture of what the community looked like over time. So I don't know yet. I'll be back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll look out for you. Deborah, this question is for you from Yarden Zamir. She's asked, have you seen any promising examples of using collective value vocabulary in economic development analysis?
I think where I got inspired was actually, I heard about labor negotiations between the union of BMW's employees in Germany with the company. And they'd have such a different tone than the way the labor negotiations are here in the United States. And they're specifically the company's value is seen in like worker health and worker success. So sort of like in the construction of the factory floor, it's really designed from the worker up versus from the output back. And that sort of got me thinking about economic impact modeling. That's not like a great example of sort of collective vocabulary in the United States, but I think it is a really interesting way to sort of think about how polarized, so many of our discussions have become, and that there are many ways to bring it back to commonalities and collective values. And we don't have to be adversarial, which is, I think, something else to introduce, that if we're using the same vocabulary, we can be actually speaking with each other and negotiating rather than competing.
I guess now we're all even. So, Spencer, this question is for you. Alex Moskovitz asked, does task make recommendations for how to improve socio-analysis or school access analysis so that local concerns can be brought into the scope?
That is in our scope of work, yes, to clarify those methodologies and advocate for not just having this tool in existence, but ultimately the seeker reform part of that is we have the intent to really advocate for updating the seeker technical manual and using this mapping process as a proof of concept that these methodologies work, and that we can then begin to think about how we update them over time. The process for updating the technical manual is really closed. It's not a public process. It happens like a rulemaking process. There's not a lot of community input or oversight into that process. And so part of this project is really to daylight what that would look like and sort of how could we ask different questions. But the school issue is complicated, both for seats, but also when we think about segregation, isolation, school performance. There's a whole host of issues that go into how do we mitigate and plan for that.
So I wanted to actually return to the question about how this might impact developers, because I actually work for a developer right now. And so I will say that at least for responsible and good, well-intentioned developers, there is research into what your tool can support with, but it's also about cost, right? And I think that the way your tool will help is giving the community the opportunity to say, actually, we'd like to demand more, not necessarily just whether or not it's currently in the rules, right? So I think that'd be something pretty interesting and a way to see the impact on developers and how much they want to do, especially when you consider projects such as the Gowanus greening zoning that has been pending for like 20 years now.
So that's a good question. I think how it benefits developers are a couple of ways. One, I would say that, yeah, the shared information is really great if people can agree. One of the things that I like to point to as a sort of data has values, not just metrics, is parking in business districts. It's often looked at to say, how much parking is there? And like, are there transportation impacts? But what we're really maybe concerned about is what's the sales per square footage for those businesses, because maybe parking's not the access issue. And if we actually care about strong, stable businesses, maybe parking is the wrong metric. And so I think having that full suite of tools, I think can help the developer and the community get agreement on what that right metric is to maximize for the project's benefit also.
So we are very close to time, right? Almost 4 o'clock. So I'm going to take one last question from Deborah, and it's actually for you, Jim. So Deborah would like to know, have you thought of using this incredible historical tool to compare or relate to geographic distribution of existing Black-owned businesses? That is a good question.
At my day job, we're looking at taking Yelp, the data from Yelp and other data sets, and other businesses that overlap. One of my wish and hope is really dig in some of the businesses that do they still exist today, and what does that look like? I know Mailing doesn't exist now. It's on 146th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. It is a community center, but I would like to see that the transformation over time. And the other data set, I'm just as a data hog here, is to, everybody knows about the 40s, the original street map, right? To link that to the 40s and the 80s, see what happens over time. But yes, I intend to see, it's a rich data set, past, present. Let's see, using all your matrix, what does that look in the future? Is that why we're together? Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Deborah. Well, I think those are actually all of our questions. So unless any of the speakers would like to give a final 30-second remark. No? Okay. So this session,
Perhaps a thank you for Hindsight and the opportunity to make this a small spark of an idea shared to get to kind of amplify. It's really lovely opportunity to chat with Spencer and Deborah. Maybe we'll have a site chat later. Yeah. Thank you.
right, and to that extent, everyone, please remember that there is a networking function on the Hopin platform. We have a couple of minutes before the closing remarks, so please feel welcome to go ahead and meet someone new. But also you can, if you'd like to continue engaging with anyone you've met in the comments or with one of the presenters, there is the option to chat them directly or video call them directly, and you can continue your conversation here over Hopin. So we are at time. Thank you everyone for joining and contributing your questions, and I hope to see you later on as well as next year.